Hello and welcome everyone back to Command and Conquer Tiberium series, the Tiberium Armory, and it's been a little while. Today we are going to be talking about the MCV. Now this is going to be probably a 2 to 3 parter because there is just so much to talk about. Just such an incredible amount to talk about. So, in this particular piece, we're going to be talking about the theory behind the MCV and why one might actually want to fight a battle that way as opposed to the more familiar modern method. To begin, I'd like to start with a quote from General Robert H. Barrow of the United States military. "Amateurs talk about tactics, but professionals study logistics." And logistics is really where the name of the game is when you want to discuss the MCVs. Now, what is an MCV? For those of us among us who haven't played the games or haven't really thought too closely about what they are. Well, an MCV stands for a mobile construction vehicle. Depending on which origin you have in your understanding of the basis for Tiberium's history, whether it came from Red Alert or whether Tiberium developed from a world very much like our own, devoid of time travel, the origin of the idea is the same. Now, the MCVs represent a very big difference in the way that wars are fought. Throughout all of history, from the time of Caesar, Scipio Africanus, and Hannibal, all the way up to Sherman and Douglas MacArthur, logistics has essentially been the same thing. You need to keep an army ready to fight, clothed, watered, fed, and safe, with whatever they might need to fight a battle at a moment's notice. All of that necessitates a baggage train. Long lines of people whose job it is to move food, fuel, and water across the long edges of the battlefield and into enemy territory in order to keep each one of the soldiers at top fighting efficiency. Now, this is the way all warfare has been fought forever, because that is just the nature of how we have to do things. We have one city. If we're talking about Greek city-states fighting each other, we have one city here and one city over there, and you might have 50 miles in between each one of those cities. You're going to fight a battle anywhere in between there, but in order to get your guys to march across the 100 or the 50 miles to the other side to finally win the battle, you need enough food and water and equipment constantly moving back through from each side in order to sustain your troops, recover from losses, and siege out the enemy's capital. The basis for the idea of the MCV is one that has been tossed around by people from all across different time periods, but has never really been feasible until now. In simple terms, the idea being that you take your logistics facilities with you onto the battlefield. Now, if this was a prehistoric army, where we're really just talking about a bunch of dudes moving from one camp to another camp and potentially picking up large clubs with rocks tied to the ends and using whatever materials are nearby the enemy's camp to then beat in the heads of the enemy, then that's one thing. But when we're talking about modern battlefields, we're talking about tens of thousands of different things that need to be sourced from all across the world to build a single rifle or to build a tank. You need tons of different materials especially when you have tanks like the Abrams or the medium tank of the Tiberium universe that has had things like depleted uranium armor. And those are not easy materials to come by. And so the idea that you take your entire logistics train, your factories, and everything with you on the battlefield, let's just ignore the thought about how you might get everything there. Let's just assume that you could produce everything on site. You need to be able to source all those materials from whatever is nearby. And functionally, unless we have Star Trek replicators and tremendous amounts of power, this is simply not possible. It has never been possible, and unless we find a material out there like Tiberium that can be synthesized and broken down into dozens of different materials, it's not likely to ever happen. But in 1995, with the advent of the Tiberian meteor, everything changed. A new material was introduced to the battlefields of the near future that allowed anyone who had sufficient know-how to break down the crystals into basically any other material, and at a very high efficiency. Meaning that as long as you had a refinery nearby, you could produce nearly anything that you could require on the battlefield in battlefield conditions behind enemy lines, assuming you could get an MCV out to the location. Now, just imagine that. The only thing that you need to transport out onto these battlefields would be the people, but otherwise, assuming you found a sufficiently safe location or you had the sufficient amount of troops to make the location safe, you could bring an entire factory with you, and provided you had a local source of Tiberium, start a production cycle that would allow you to start within days producing Tiberium-based or sourced medium tanks, mammoth tanks, stealth tanks, other buildings, Hand of Nod, the Temple of Nod, any of these sorts of buildings completely built from the ground up from local materials. Now, in real life, there of course isn't Tiberium, but there has actually been something like this that has been introduced, and the older ones among the fan base might have heard of it. It's a MASH, like the TV show, book, and movie. It stands for Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and it is an attempt that the United States made, being first established in August of 1945, to deploy a fully functional hospital in a combat area. And this was important because the primary cause of death for soldiers in World War II and really any time period is not the enemy, it's dying of your wounds after a battle or while a battle is still being fought. Just imagine you are in a tense firefight the last days at a time. You're not able to get a tremendous amount of support up to you. Or so you get shot and your buddies try to bring you back to the lines, but they don't have anything to try to effectively dislodge the bullet that's inside your gut, and slowly an infection kills you. This is what the reality of warfare is like for just about everybody out on the battlefield. And so the idea that you could bring a fully functional surgical hospital out into a combat area of operations, deploy it, see up to 300 casualties in a day, and then decommission it and move it to someplace else further behind the lines was an incredible achievement. Now, more recently, the United States has converted this to the combat support hospital, but the effect is the same. You have an area of operations under heavy combat, and maybe half a mile to a mile behind those lines, you have the fully functional hospital that is set up on the backs of trucks or helicopters, and then if the battle comes towards you, you can decommission it and move it further back at a moment's notice. Realistically, a couple of hours' notice, but very, very quickly. And this revolutionized combat, because the casualty numbers that we were looking at going through World War II and World War I were absolutely tremendously huge. And most of those people could have survived, or a fair amount, let's say, a fair amount of those people could have survived if they had access to proper medical care, which of course they never did, because technology wasn't really up to snuff and these sorts of things had not been created yet. Now, switching back to Command and Conquer, the MCV is a similar concept. Every year, the United States military spends billions and billions of dollars moving material up and down the battlefields of the Middle East, trying to get everything where they need to be in order to continue to fight the battles that they need to silence the Islamic State and whatever it is out there that we are still fighting against in that never-ending war. But every day, tons upon tons upon tons of meals ready to eat, ammunition, fuel, everything is transported across helicopters, trucks, boats, from factories all across the world, whose materials are sourced from places all across the world in turn again. Now, if you have a tank, let's say, and some of those materials in the electronics are only found in Africa, let's say, there's some large cobalt mines in Africa, you must source those materials, transport them all the way to the United States or to a allied factory that's then refines them and creates them and turns them those into materials that are sent to other factories that are then sent to as a final project in the tank, which is then shipped again overseas to the battlefield. The more advanced warfare gets, the more expensive each tool becomes, and the more expensive the logistical system becomes. And the potential ability to create whatever materials you need locally on the scene is a very, very big deal. In a more specific sense, the MCV's job was to roll onto the battlefield. It's not clear exactly if the MCVs could be airlifted, but I imagine that with sufficient Orca technology, you could airlift it, maybe short distances or at great fuel expenses. The MCV would deploy, telescope out into a large building, and then begin producing everything from materials stored within to be able to produce other buildings that are modular and can be produced on scene that will then produce other war materials. So if you ever seen one of those telescoping houses where, although those are pretty new, you have what looks like a trade freight canister. You've seen those things that are on the transport ships. You set one of those down, and I'll probably show something to you in the background here, but you set one of those down and then press a button and the thing unfolds into a larger structure. It kind of telescopes out into the larger structure that then has the living quarters within. And the MCV does this. It telescopes out and begins to produce the materials needed for these buildings. So essentially you'd have a MCV building the prefab materials for a barracks or a refinery that would then be assembled by machines or people on site into the final form. If I may, you might take a second to imagine the battlefield of the Tiberium future consisting of not a fully deploying MCV that kind of depresses into the ground and creates this giant structure and then just sort of magically deploys the rest of the structures around them, but rather the MCVs have a large crew of engineers that assemble the buildings from these prefabricated parts built by the MCVs that are then put together and create the buildings around them. So you have a lot more staff and a lot more people running around making these constructions. These are not instant builds. They likely take, quite a few hours to days to construct. So when we're talking about one of these battles, a lot of the times they're actually going to be slowed down quite a bit, because if a MCV is brought onto the scene, it's not likely that they could get the facilities to the point of being able to fully deploy and begin manufacturing vehicles and equipment in a 10-minute time frame in the way you can in the games. At least until we get to Tiberium Wars, where the technology has been evolving for quite a long time. And that can be sort of debatable. Getting off of that tangent here for a second, we can see that the effect of this is that the initial transport, the goods that you need to bring onto the battlefield, are essentially just the MCV, whatever supporting military infrastructure or vehicles that you need to be bringing along to defend it, and the facilities, materials that you would need to be able to construct things initially. And then after that, the only thing you need to supply continuously to the battlefield are the soldiers, the engineers, the pilots that you need to utilize all of this new infrastructure in vehicles and equipment. Assuming that this could be possible, this could be feasible, this would mean that the logistical supply train, the billions of dollars in materials and funds that are spent every year by organizations like, or nations like the United States, or Russia, or China, or the UK, to move all of that material around and get things set up, has now been reduced by tremendously wide margins. All you need is transport helicopters or planes to paradrop people into the combat zone where the MCV is, who can then pilot the vehicles or produce the structures. You don't need to bring huge amounts of materials with you. Now, you don't need to take an AC-130 and bring a dozen tanks in that giant thing. You can have the one MCV on the battlefield deploy, and all of a sudden you have your entire forward operating base that you're producing vehicles at. And make no mistake, this means a reduction in cost of the fighting being like billions and billions of dollars cheaper. Although here, this is supposed to be a fairly small explanation, but it's been about 19 minutes now. There are, let's say, a number of potential drawbacks to this that, even if there was a wonder material like Tiberium, would make this a somewhat unlikely build, an unlikely concept to have made. Especially in times like World War II, if this alternate future of Red Alert were to be the origins here. And that is that a vehicle like the MCV is a gigantic target. It is the most pivotal bit of infrastructure that your entire war relies on. If you can get a missile or a bit of artillery in that hits it and disables it, well then what else is there? Unless you have a fully functioning base that can then repair it, that's you knocked out of the battlefield. The advantage of having a constant stream of venom materials coming to you through a supply chain is that everything is constantly fed in, and one thing is replaced immediately. No one thing is so important that it can completely destroy your ability to fight. And this is sort of the thing that in my couple weeks of research on this, looking at World War II logistical systems and fighting, looking at ancient logistical systems and warfare, that seems to be the deal breaker here. Could you knock out the MCV and destroy an entire theater's progress in one go? And this is enough of a threat that I think that it wouldn't be particularly likely to happen in any other universe but the Tiberium series, or potentially even the Command & Conquer series as a whole. Because at the beginning of the Tiberian War in 2019, the world was a very different place to what the world was like even at the start of the Second World War. There really isn't a good comparison. To the uninitiated, the beginning of the First Tiberian War was an incredibly dangerous, bifurcated situation. The G7 countries, united under the United Nations Global Defense Initiative, had most of Western Europe and most of all of the Americas under their control. But essentially everyone else had declared, one way or another, for Cain. And from 1995 to 2019, they had decades to dig in and prepare for the war that Cain had been preparing for thousands of years. This means that as the fighting continued, every back alley is mined, every structure is set up to be a bunker. Every bit of land is built into fortifications. The United Nations Global Defense Initiative has to take every inch as effectively, as cost effectively as possible, because they have so much disputed ground to cover. And this goes even double and then triple for the Second and then Third Tiberian Wars, where a large portion of the world have gotten to the point where most of their citizens have never known anything but NOD or GDI occupation. America and Western Europe have been bastions of fortification, and they've been blue zones for so long and been fortified for so long under the military junta of GDI. And the yellow and red zones, well, they've spent their entire lives fortifying and conditioning themselves against the harsh life in those red and yellow zones, with their only friends being NOD. NOD, who, despite having been defeated 2 times already by the start of the Third Tiberian War, is the only one that seems to consistently be there, handing out supplies and buying goodwill. And so every bit of space becomes continuously more difficult to traverse. Blasted landscapes of former cities infected with Tiberium, large stretches of population, mutants or otherwise, dug in through decades of desperate living. The world that has been created by the Tiberian Wars is not like the world that was there in World War II or in the wars that were afterwards. There were no friendly pockets in the areas that are being fought over. The GDI might have a huge spear tip that juts straight through Eastern Europe, heading towards Sarajevo, but imagine flying over that area with supplies, knowing that each one of those buildings underneath you might contain a stinger or a SAM site operated by some citizen Kane has brainwashed into complete subservience, knowing that you could be shot down at any moment. Or think about delivering a grain shipment to large sections of the populous and yellow zones and not knowing whether or not you're going to be targeted with an IED. This is a very real situation for much of the GDI's population, and since most of the fighting takes place in these red and yellow zones, this is the sort of situation that they're asked to fight in, which makes the MCV an even bigger deal. Because if you can't expect to get anything but the highest level of attrition flying in new materials and transporting things across the sea, then what you need is a large force to bring in a facility that you can then build on site and use as a stronghold against the sea of resistance that is going to be hitting them from every side. Because if they can't make it to Sarajevo, Kane cannot be stopped. And they have to make some headway somehow. And they're the GDI, of course. They can't just go through and destroy every town they pass through. So, what better way to take advantage of your technological supremacy than to bring the factories and logistics supply with you onto the battlefield? It makes a lot more sense when you view it from that perspective, and keeping in mind the texture of the battlefield of this near future conflict of the Tiberian Wars. Here at the end, I'd like to take a moment to say that this is probably going to be part 1 of a potentially 3-part series on the MCV, with the second part definitely talking about the physics and potential impracticalities of such a vehicle. And while this will be a Tiberium Armory video, I also kind of want it to be a video that will be talking about the Tiberium Wars as a whole. The Command & Conquer series is a series that, unfortunately, as much is a RTS game. And so we will see the world from this very distorted perspective. What do these battles look like? What does the Battle of Sarajevo from Command & Conquer Tiberium Wars actually look like when you take into consideration the levels of the distances that are involved in each one of these battles? How large are the maps? How large are the ranges of each one of the weapons? The MCVs, would they be this far forward or that far forward? How long did this battle take? How many people realistically died over the course of them? What does the logistics look like for the course of this battle? That sort of thing. The tapestry of the battles in Command & Conquer are very different from what we see in the game. And I'd like to sort of make some videos coming up about what sorts of things might better represent the incredible reality of the combat and theaters of war in this series. Eventually, I'd like to do something where I go through a particular series and go, okay, so the GDI campaign of Tiberian War or something like that, or Tib Dawn, and go into detail about each particular battle. And my plan for this is to have video footage of me or another person that's more skilled at the game playing through the game, and at the hardest difficulty, losing the fewest amount of units possible, and use that as the basis for how the battle would have looked like, and then try to reinterpret the battle through what we know as the more realistic lens of the battlefield that we can see from the videos in the Tiberium Armory series. And I guess a short example of that would be the Obelisk of Light being a very large tower that can project a laser. Well, most lasers that are around today that the military uses can destroy engine blocks from up to a mile away, and a laser that is capable of melting through armor and detonating the interior explosives and contained within tanks, well, something that powerful could conceivably hit targets from a mile away. And it's very possible that they could also hit low-flying aircraft or slow-moving aircraft. They're not quite the obelisks of darkness that Cabal is using, but they should, in all honesty, be able to hit any of these things, and they would make a formidable enemy. You place one of these concealed in a desperate position or good position, stealthed, and only appearing for brief seconds, firing an almost incomprehensibly bright laser for a quarter of a second that melts a tank a mile away, then that changes the way we have to look at these battles and how we were able to approach thinking about the true scale of the devastation that we're talking about. And that's it. That's the end of this video. We're going on 32 minutes, 28 seconds now. It's going to be one of my longer videos, and I'm kind of happy about that, but let me hear what you guys think about it in the comment section, and if you like what you're hearing, tell me, and I'll try to do these more speculative videos more often. I hope you guys have a wonderful day. Yeah. This is Game Master Karrakin signing off.